April 9th, 1865. A man rode slowly toward a farmhouse in rural Virginia. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. His gray uniform was immaculate. Every brass button was fastened. His sword gleamed at his side. He had dressed, deliberately, magnificently, for surrender. His name was Robert Edward Lee, and in 2 hours he would sign away the largest Confederate army still standing, ending 4 years of the bloodiest war America has ever known. But here is what nobody writes on the historical plaques. Inside that farmhouse, before Ulysses Grant even arrived, Lee sat, completely, utterly alone. His officers would later recall that he said nothing, not a single word. He just stared at the wall with those gray eyes, the same eyes that had frozen Union generals from Antietam to Cold Harbor. And they were empty. What was going through his mind in that silence? Was he relieved? Crushed?
Did he feel the weight of the 260,000 Confederate soldiers who had died under his command? Did he replay the decisions? Cold Harbor, where in 8 brutal minutes 7,000 Union soldiers were cut down in a frontal assault. Pickett's charge, where 12,500 of his own men walked across open ground into a wall of fire, and half of them never walked back. Or was he thinking about something older, something that happened 4 years earlier? In a house on a hill above the Potomac River, on 2 sleepless nights in April 1861. Because Robert E. Lee didn't have to be in that gray uniform. He had been offered command of the entire Union Army. He turned it down. That one decision, made quietly in a candlelit study at Arlington, Virginia, set in motion 4 years of catastrophic war. 620,000 Americans would die. A nation would tear itself in half, and a mythology would be born that still divides us today. Who was Robert E. Lee, really? Military genius or fatally flawed commander? Reluctant warrior or willing architect of a rebellion built on slavery? The noble, tragic hero of lost cause legend? Or something more complicated, more human, and far more troubling? The truth is stranger than either story, and it starts not in Virginia, not in the war itself, but in the ruins of a family that was already falling apart before Robert E. Lee was old enough to understand why. If you want more stories like this, the ones that get buried under the official version, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel goes places history textbooks are afraid to go, and what comes next in this story, you will not see coming. Robert Edward Lee was born on January 19th, 1807, at Stratford Hall, the great Lee family estate in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His father was Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, a Revolutionary War cavalry hero, a personal friend of George Washington, a former governor of Virginia. The name alone was a kind of currency in the South, but by the time Robert could walk, that currency was worthless. Light Horse Harry Lee was catastrophic with money. He borrowed recklessly. He speculated in land schemes that collapsed. He borrowed from friends, from strangers, from George Washington himself, and never repaid a single debt. By 1809, he was sitting in a debtor's prison. By 1813, he was so physically destroyed, beaten nearly to death by a political mob in Baltimore, and so financially ruined that he sailed for the Caribbean and never came home. Robert E. Lee was 6 years old when his father left. He never saw him again. His mother, Ann Carter Lee, was left alone with 5 children, a depleted family fortune, and a last name that everyone in Virginia recognized, but that had quietly become, in certain drawing rooms, a synonym for failure and disgrace. She moved the family to Alexandria, and Robert, the youngest son, became the household's anchor. He managed the home. He nursed his chronically ill mother. He learned at an age when most boys were playing in fields what it meant to be responsible for everything. This shaped him in ways that would echo through every decision of his life. He couldn't afford mistakes. He couldn't afford recklessness. He couldn't afford to be his father. He entered West Point in 1825 and graduated in 1829, second in his entire class, with a record that has never been fully matched before or since. He earned 0 demerits in 4 years, not one. In an era when cadets routinely drank, gambled, brawled, and broke regulations, Robert E. Lee walked through West Point like a man carved from stone. His engineering work was brilliant. His bearing was striking. Even as a young cadet, people reached for the same word to describe him: marble. He looked like a Roman statue. He was so poised, so composed, so almost inhumanly controlled that people sometimes genuinely forgot he was a man and not a monument. He married Mary Anna Custis in 1831, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, heiress to Arlington House, a grand white-columned estate on the hills directly above the Potomac, with a view that took in all of Washington City on a clear day. The match was both strategic and genuine, and it gave Robert E. Lee something his father had never managed to hold: a home. Arlington became the center of his identity, more than Virginia, more than the Army, more in the end than the United States of America. He spent the decades between 1831 and 1861 doing what a career Army officer does: engineering projects on the Mississippi River, a posting in Texas, the superintendency of West Point itself. He was away from Arlington for long, painful stretches, and his letters home during those years reveal a man perpetually torn in two. His duty pulled one direction. His heart pulled toward that house on the hill. His performance in the Mexican-American War under General Winfield Scott was extraordinary. Scott called him, without hesitation, the greatest military genius in America. Lee was 40 years old, lean and relentlessly courageous, personally scouting terrain that appeared impassable and finding routes through it that changed the course of entire battles. At Cerro Gordo, he crossed the Pedregal, a vast, jagged field of hardened volcanic rock that no experienced officer believed an army could move through, and found a flanking path that shattered Santa Anna's defensive position. Scott later said the entire Mexican campaign would have failed without him. But here is where the portrait gets complicated. Robert E. Lee owned enslaved people. He managed enslaved people. He enforced their bondage. Records from Arlington, including his own handwritten correspondence, document a man who accepted the institution of slavery not reluctantly, but practically. There is a documented account of 3 enslaved people who escaped from Arlington in 1859. Lee had them returned, ordered them whipped, and according to a witness, had their wounds rubbed with salt. Historians still debate the full picture. Some argue Lee was privately troubled by slavery while publicly compliant with its demands. His own letter to his wife in 1856 called slavery, and these are his words, a moral and political evil. But in that same letter, he argued it was harder on white people than on black people, and that the problem belonged to God rather than to man. Read that twice. He could see that something was wrong. He chose to do nothing. That capacity for moral clarity without moral action is not a minor detail. It is the key to everything that follows. By the winter of 1860, the United States was cracking down the center. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, the day after Abraham Lincoln's election was certified. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed within weeks. Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as President of the Confederate States of America on February 18, 1861, and Robert E. Lee, now 54 years old, a colonel in the United States Army stationed in Texas, watched all of it unfold from a distance and described what he was witnessing in letters as anarchy. He did not want secession. He wrote to his son Custis in January 1861, "I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than a dissolution of the Union. I am willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation." Everything but honor. Hold that phrase, because it becomes a trap. In February, Lee was recalled to Washington. The Army was mobilizing, and Winfield Scott, still General-in-Chief, still Lee's greatest champion, wanted his best man close. On April 18, 1861, Francis Blair Sr., acting as a direct intermediary for the Lincoln administration, sat down with Lee and offered him field command of the Union forces being assembled to suppress the rebellion. By most accounts, the offer involved nearly 90,000 men and full operational authority. Lee declined. He went immediately from that meeting to Scott's office, told him what he had done, and Scott, himself a Virginian who had chosen the Union, said quietly, "Lee, you have made the greatest mistake of your life, but I feared it would be so." 2 days later, Virginia voted to secede. On April 20th, 1861, Lee composed his resignation from the United States Army. It took him 2 nights to write it. He wrote to his sister Anne, who opposed secession and would never fully forgive him. "With all my devotion to the Union and the feeling of loyalty and duty of an American citizen, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. There it is. Not slavery, not constitutional principle, not states' rights. Home, Arlington House, his children, those hills above the Potomac, the lost cause mythology that grew up around Lee after the war would frame this choice as noble self-sacrifice. The great man, tormented but principled, choosing Virginia over empire." Modern historians look at it very differently. They point out that Lee had served the United States Army for 32 years, that the Confederacy whose commission he accepted had been explicitly built, in the words of its own Vice President Alexander Stephens, on the cornerstone of racial slavery. That other Virginia-born officers, most famously General George Thomas, faced the same impossible choice and chose the Union. Lee chose otherwise. And the cruelest irony of all, Arlington House, the home he was protecting, was seized by the Union Army within weeks of his resignation letter. His wife Mary, crippled with arthritis, was carried out by servants. By June of 1861, Union tents covered the front lawn. By 1864, the government had converted the Arlington estate into a cemetery for Union war dead. The very men Robert E. Lee would spend 4 years killing were buried in his front yard. He never went home again. He was given command of Virginia's military forces on April 23, 1861, and entered the war not with thunder, but with paperwork. For the first full year of the conflict, he was primarily a staff officer, writing defensive plans, suffering a series of fumbled campaigns in Western Virginia that earned him the mocking nickname Granny Lee from a Confederate press that had not yet seen what this man could do. What changed everything was one bullet. On May 31, 1862, at the Battle of Seven Pines outside Richmond, Confederate General Joseph Johnston was struck and carried from the field. Jefferson Davis needed a replacement. He turned to Lee. On June 1, 1862, Robert E. Lee assumed command of what he immediately renamed the Army of Northern Virginia. The war did not just shift, it tilted on its axis. George McClellan had spent the spring of 1862 inching his way up the Virginia Peninsula toward Richmond with 100,000 men. He had numerical superiority. He had shorter supply lines. He had a president in Washington who was desperate for someone, anyone, to take Richmond and end this nightmare. McClellan hesitated. He always hesitated. He overestimated Confederate strength at every turn, requested more reinforcements, constructed elaborate defensive works, and moved through Virginia like a man who was terrified of losing rather than determined to win. Then Lee took command. Within weeks, Lee had designed the 7 Days Battles, a series of punishing, aggressive assaults from June 25th to July 1st that drove McClellan's massive army away from the Confederate capital. Tactically, many of the individual battles were messy disasters for Lee. His plans were too complex for the Confederate command system. Coordination broke down repeatedly. At Malvern Hill on the final day, he sent infantry charging straight at Union artillery on high ground and paid a brutal price for it, but strategically, none of that mattered. McClellan retreated to the James River. Richmond was saved. And the general, who 2 months earlier had been called Granny Lee, was now the most feared commander on either side of the war. He understood something that most Civil War commanders took years to learn, that warfare has a psychological dimension as real as any tactical one. He wasn't just trying to kill Union soldiers, he was trying to kill Union confidence, to make every general who faced him, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, believe that whatever they tried, however clever their plan, he would already be 3 moves ahead. Second Bull Run, August 1862. Lee faced a Union force significantly larger than his own and responded by splitting his army, a decision that every military textbook would classify as reckless to the point of madness. He sent Stonewall Jackson on a 54-mile flanking march around the Union position. Jackson's corps destroyed Pope's enormous supply depot at Manassas Junction, then dug in and waited in the tree line like a coiled spring. Pope, furious and confused, attacked Jackson repeatedly, convinced he had him trapped. Then James Longstreet's corps came out of the trees and hit Pope's exposed flank like a door slamming on a man's hand. Pope's army broke apart. Union casualties reached over 16,000. Confederate losses, roughly 9,000. The gap in those numbers mattered enormously, but not in the way you might expect. Because every man Lee lost was harder, much harder to replace than every man Grant or McClellan or Pope lost. The Confederacy had roughly a third of the Union's manpower. Lee fought like a gambler who thought he had unlimited chips. He didn't. After Second Bull Run, he invaded Maryland, the first Confederate push into Northern Territory. The political goals were as important as the military ones. A victory on Northern soil might convince England or France to recognize the Confederacy. It might trigger a Maryland uprising against federal authority. It might shatter Northern morale enough to force peace negotiations. None of it happened. And what followed became one of the most pivotal days in American history. September 13th, 1862. 3 Union soldiers found something in a field near Frederick, Maryland. 3 cigars bundled together, wrapped in a piece of paper. The paper turned out to be Special Order 191, Robert E. Lee's complete operational plan for the entire Maryland campaign, with the locations and intended movements of every Confederate division written out in precise detail. It had been dropped by a Confederate officer and forgotten in a field. Now George McClellan had it. "Here is a paper," McClellan reportedly told a general, "with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." He had 16 hours to act before Lee could possibly react and adjust his positions. McClellan waited 18. That hesitation, just 2 extra hours, gave a Confederate sympathizer enough time to warn Lee that his plans were compromised. Lee rushed his scattered forces toward Sharpsburg, Maryland, set his lines with Antietam Creek in front of him and the Potomac River behind him, and waited. On September 17, 1862, McClellan attacked. Antietam remains, to this day, the single bloodiest day in the entire history of American warfare. By the time the guns stopped, there were 22,717 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. In one day, on one battlefield, the sunken road, a shallow wagon track worn down over years of farm use, became a Confederate defensive position. Union troops attacked it for nearly 4 hours. When the line finally broke, the road was literally filled with Confederate dead, bodies stacked and tangled so thick that men later recalled being able to walk the length of that road without their feet ever touching the ground. At the cornfield, in the battle's terrible morning phase, the fighting swept back and forth across the same 24 acres so many times that by mid-morning, the entire field of standing corn had been cut flat by rifle fire alone, the stalks mowed as cleanly as if a scythe had passed through them. Lee held. He held with an army he had no logical right to hold with, against forces that outnumbered him nearly 2-1, because McClellan refused to commit his reserves to a final crushing blow. On September 18th, the Confederate Army withdrew across the Potomac back into Virginia. McClellan claimed victory. Technically, it was. The Confederates left the field. And for Abraham Lincoln, it was enough. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The war's stated purpose transformed, officially and permanently, from reunion to liberation. That proclamation destroyed Confederate hopes for European intervention. Neither Britain nor France was willing to formally support a slaveholders' rebellion when the United States had declared the war was now explicitly about ending slavery. Lee had crossed the Potomac hoping to reshape the war's direction. He crossed back having set it in stone. Now, here's something I want to ask you directly, and I want you to think about it seriously before you scroll. McClellan had Lee's complete battle plan in his hands. He had a 16-hour window. He had numerical superiority, and he waited too long. Drop a comment right now. If you were McClellan on September 13th, 1862, holding that piece of paper, do you move immediately, or do you hesitate? What breaks first, your nerve or your logistics? Your answer in the comments. Because the next part of this story is where Robert E. Lee goes from great to legendary, and from legendary straight toward the cliff edge. His next two great victories came in the winter and spring of 1863, and they are, without question, the masterpieces of his career. They are also the exact moments where the seeds of everything that would eventually destroy him were planted and took root. Fredericksburg, December 13th, 1862. Ambrose Burnside threw wave after wave of Union infantry across the Rappahannock River in direct frontal assaults against Lee's entrenched positions on Marye's Heights. It was not really a battle. It was an equation. Open ground plus stone wall plus concentrated musket fire equaled slaughter. The math was that simple and that horrifying. Union casualties reached 12,653. Confederate losses, 5,309. As the Union assault waves came on and crumbled and came on again, Lee turned to Longstreet and said something that has been quoted in nearly every biography written about him since. He said, "It is well that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it." Historians debate whether those were his exact words. Multiple accounts document the moment with slight variations. What no one debates is the sentiment. A man watching thousands of human beings die, and feeling something in that moment that resembled awe. Then came Chancellorsville, May 1st through 4th, 1863. If Fredericksburg showed Lee's mastery of defensive warfare, Chancellorsville showed something far rarer: the ability to turn a desperate, outnumbered situation into a masterpiece of offensive maneuver through sheer audacity. Joseph Hooker had 133,000 men. Lee had 60,000. Hooker crossed the Rappahannock and successfully flanked Lee's position. It was a genuinely dangerous, well-executed move. Lee responded by doing the one thing no rational commander should ever do when already outnumbered. He split his army. He sent Stonewall Jackson on a 12-mile flanking march through the dense woodland known as the Wilderness. 28,000 Confederate soldiers moved through thick forest in near total concealment. At approximately 5:15 in the evening of May 2nd, they emerged from the tree line directly into the exposed right flank of Hooker's 11th Corps. The Union Corps came apart in under 2 hours. Hooker, stunned and suddenly uncertain of everything, began pulling his forces back. Chancellorsville would be forever called Lee's greatest victory, a triumph of nerve and intelligence against an opponent who should have been unbeatable. And then, in the growing darkness after the battle, Stonewall Jackson rode forward to personally scout the ground ahead. His own troops, hearing horses approaching in the dark, opened fire. Jackson was hit 3 times. He lost his arm that night. 8 days later, pneumonia killed him. Lee, when he heard, wrote, "I have lost my right arm." He hadn't just lost a general, he had lost the only subordinate in his entire army who could fully translate Lee's aggressive, instinctive operational thinking into battlefield action. Longstreet was methodical, deliberate, defensive by nature. Ambrose Powell Hill was impetuous and unreliable under pressure. Richard Ewell was cautious. None of them were Jackson. In 5 weeks, Lee would ask those men to fight like Jackson at a small crossroads town in Pennsylvania. The Second Confederate invasion of the North began in June 1863 with roughly 75,000 men. The stated goals were logical: draw the Union Army out of Virginia, relieve pressure on the state, gather desperately needed supplies from Pennsylvania's farms, and potentially threaten Washington or Baltimore enough to force some kind of peace negotiation. Nobody planned for Gettysburg.
On July 1st, 1863, Confederate forces moving toward the town looking for supplies stumbled into Union cavalry, and a small meeting engagement exploded outward into the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. By the end of the first day, Union forces had been pushed back through the town itself, but they held the high ground south of Gettysburg, Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top, Culp's Hill, and reinforcements were arriving by the hour. The strategic situation on the morning of July 2nd was completely cleared to James Longstreet, Lee's senior corps commander and one of the war's most astute tactical minds. The Union Army held elevated defensible ground. It was growing stronger with every passing hour. Longstreet argued, directly and plainly, that the Army of Northern Virginia should move around the Union left, get between the Federal Army and Washington, and force the Union to attack Confederate positions for once rather than the other way around. Lee said no. He attacked. Why? This is perhaps the most debated decision in all of Civil War history. Some historians argue Lee was overconfident, still intoxicated by the genius of Chancellorsville. Others point to a collapse in his command communication. Lee issued orders in language so deliberately vague that they functioned more as suggestions than commands, reflecting his old reliance on subordinates like Jackson, who had needed no more than a hint to execute brilliantly. Some modern historians believe Lee was in the early stages of the heart disease that would eventually kill him, and that it was affecting his judgment in subtle but consequential ways. What is documented, without question, is this: On July 2nd, Longstreet attacked the Union left at Peach Orchard Wheatfield, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top. The fighting was catastrophic and ultimately inconclusive. Little Round Top, the rocky hillside anchoring the entire Union left flank, was saved in one of the war's most celebrated moments when Colonel Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Regiment, completely out of ammunition, ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge downhill. The charge broke the Confederate assault by the narrowest possible margin. On July 3rd, Lee ordered Pickett's charge. 12,500 Confederate soldiers would assault across 3/4 of a mile of open, gently rising ground directly against the fortified center of the Union line. Longstreet, ordered to give the command to advance, reportedly could not bring himself to speak the words aloud. He simply nodded. At 3 in the afternoon on July 3rd, 1863, those 12,500 men stepped out of the tree line into the open sunlight. Confederate artillery had bombarded the Union center for nearly 2 hours before the charge, the largest artillery barrage ever assembled on the North American continent up to that point. It accomplished almost nothing. The shells flew long, tearing up empty fields and supply wagons behind the Union lines. The Federal infantry crouched behind their stone walls and waited. And then they came. The men of Pickett's division, Trimble's division, Pettigrew's division, in perfect formation, flags flying, the kind of parade ground advance that made witnesses on both sides catch their breath despite themselves. Union artillery opened first with solid shot, then canister, each cannon round becoming a blast of iron balls like a massive shotgun. The Confederate formations compressed, shifted, kept moving. Then the Union infantry rose from behind the stone wall and opened fire. Of the 12,500 men who stepped out of the trees, approximately half became casualties. Of those who actually crossed the stone wall, a few hundred perhaps, all were killed or captured within minutes. The charge lasted less than an hour from beginning to end. As the survivors staggered back through the smoke toward Confederate lines, Robert E. Lee rode out to meet them on Traveler, and he said, over and over, to every man who passed him, "It's all my fault. It was all my fault. This has been my fight, and upon my shoulders rests the blame." It was an extraordinary thing for a Civil War general to say. He meant every word. Gettysburg cost Lee approximately 28,000 casualties out of 75,000 men engaged, more than 1 in 3 of his soldiers. The Army of Northern Virginia never fully recovered. Never again did Lee command the numbers, the strength, or the strategic momentum to mount a serious offensive operation. Now here's the question I want you to think about. And I mean really think about this before you scroll past. Longstreet warned Lee not to attack at Gettysburg. He was right. Lee attacked anyway. Was that decision the result of genius gone wrong, overconfidence, failing health, or something else entirely? What do you think? Drop it in the comments right now. Military historians have argued about this for 160 years. I want to know your take, because this community's answers are always sharper than the textbooks. March 1864. Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies and came east to face Lee directly. These two men had never met across a battlefield. They were, in almost every imaginable way, opposites. Lee was aristocratic, controlled, emotionally precise. Grant was rumpled, unpretentious, and possessed of what his subordinates described as a terrible, almost inhuman patience. Where every Union general before him had retreated after a bloody engagement with Lee, had pulled back across the river, requested more men, reconsidered their position, Grant simply moved forward, always forward. The Overland campaign began on May 4th, 1864, when Grant crossed the Rapidan River and entered the wilderness. the same dense, tangled woodland where Lee had destroyed Hooker's army exactly 1 year before. The Battle of the Wilderness lasted from May 5th through May 7th. It was pure, undifferentiated chaos. The trees and undergrowth were so dense that artillery became useless and maintaining any kind of formation was nearly impossible. Men fought in near-total darkness, guided by muzzle flashes and screaming. The dry underbrush caught fire and wounded soldiers burned to death where they had fallen, unable to be reached. Both sides suffered roughly 28,000 combined casualties in 2 days of fighting that produced no decisive result. And then Grant moved south. Not north, not back across the river. South, toward the enemy. When the Union soldiers realized they were advancing rather than retreating after carnage on that scale, the response along the road was spontaneous and extraordinary. They cheered. They threw their hats. Some of them wept. Grant's resolution in that moment, his refusal to follow the script that Lee had written for every previous Union commander, was the first thing that had genuinely impressed them in a very long time. At Spotsylvania Courthouse from May 8th through May 21st, the fighting continued in conditions that Civil War veterans would later describe, without exaggeration, as the worst of the entire war. A protruding bulge in the Confederate line known as the Mule Shoe salient became the site of 20 hours of nearly continuous hand-to-hand combat on May 12th. Men fought across log breastworks so low that soldiers on opposite sides could reach across and grab the rifle barrels of the men trying to kill them. Trees directly behind the Confederate line were cut completely down by rifle fire alone, the trunks sawed through by the sheer accumulated volume of lead. That section of the Spotsylvania battlefield is still called Bloody Angle. Lee, during these weeks, attempted to personally lead counterattacks on multiple occasions. His own troops stopped him each time. At the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, soldiers grabbed the reins of his horse traveler and turned him back toward safety. They refused to advance until he moved away from the front line. Lee to the rear became something between a battle cry and a prayer, an army so bound to its commander that it would not watch him sacrifice himself even in the middle of its own desperate fight for survival. Cold Harbor, June 3, 1864. Grant ordered a frontal assault on entrenched Confederate positions northeast of Richmond. The attack lasted approximately 8 minutes before the forward movement stopped entirely. Union casualties in those 8 minutes, approximately 7,000 men. Confederate casualties, a few hundred. Ulysses Grant later wrote in his memoirs, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made." He called it his greatest mistake. It was also the last major battlefield victory Robert E. Lee would ever achieve. Because Grant, rather than retreating again, executed a brilliant strategic move in June, crossing the James River in a maneuver of considerable engineering complexity and striking for Petersburg, the vital railroad hub 23 miles south of Richmond. Petersburg was the artery through which Richmond breathed. If it fell, Richmond fell. If Richmond fell, the Confederacy fell. Lee arrived at Petersburg barely in time to prevent its capture. And what followed was 292 days of siege warfare. Trenches, artillery duels, starvation rations, and a slow, grinding attrition that prefigured the Western Front of the First World War by 50 years. On July 30th, 1864, Union troops who had been former Pennsylvania coal miners completed a tunnel more than 500 feet long beneath the Confederate lines and detonated 4 tons of black powder. The explosion created a crater 60 feet deep and 170 feet wide, killing or burying more than 200 Confederate soldiers in an instant. The Union assault that followed was a catastrophically mismanaged failure. Lee's lines held, but the lines were stretching thinner every month. By early 1865, Lee's soldiers were starving on rations reduced to a quarter of what the body needs. Horses were dying of hunger. Men were deserting by the hundreds, not from cowardice, but from the arithmetic of survival. Lee was promoted in February 1865 to General-in-Chief of all Confederate armies. It was an honor that meant nothing, a promotion handed to a man on a sinking ship. He wrote to Jefferson Davis with the cold clarity of a man who has stopped lying to himself. I fear a necessity may be forced on us of abandoning our position at night. He was, of course, right. On April 2nd, 1865, Grant's forces broke through the Petersburg lines at multiple points simultaneously. Lee sent an urgent message to Davis. Richmond had to be evacuated that night. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government fled south into the darkness. The city burned behind them. The Confederate capital, the city Robert E. Lee had bled for 4 consecutive years to protect, was in flames as they left it. For 7 days, the Army of Northern Virginia moved west along the Appomattox River. They were trying to reach a supply depot at Lynchburg, trying to link with Joseph Johnston's force in North Carolina, trying to find one more way to keep fighting. Some way. Any way. They were down to roughly 26,000 men, half of them without weapons, many without shoes. The army that had terrified the Union High Command for 3 years was dissolving into the Virginia countryside, men walking away not in cowardice, but in the simple, clear-eyed recognition that it was done. Grant sent notes. They were polite and almost gentle in their phrasing, asking Lee to consider surrender to spare his soldiers further suffering. Lee deflected, probed, asked what terms would be offered. On April 8th, Grant made his offer. Officers could keep their sidearms, men could keep their horses if they personally owned them, everyone would be paroled rather than imprisoned. No one would be prosecuted. The final Confederate line collapsed on the morning of April 9th. At Appomattox Courthouse, Lee found himself surrounded on 3 sides. His last cavalry attack broke against a wall of Union infantry. There was, simply, nowhere left to go. He put on his best uniform. He told an aide quietly that he would rather die 1,000 deaths than do what he was now about to do. Then he mounted Traveler, the iron-gray horse that had carried him through 4 years and 1,000 miles of war, and rode to the McLean farmhouse. Grant arrived in a private's uniform coat, spattered with mud from hard riding, without a sword. He apologized for his appearance. The 2 men sat together, and remarkably, spoke for a while about Mexico. 2 old soldiers remembering a war they had both fought in as young men, on the same side, in a country that felt very far away. Grant later wrote that he felt not triumphant in that moment, but deeply sad. Sad at the downfall of a man who had fought so long and so hard. The surrender terms were signed. The Army of Northern Virginia ceased to exist. Outside, as Lee emerged and mounted Traveler to ride back to his men, Union soldiers began firing artillery in celebration. Grant ordered them to stop immediately. He said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." Lee rode back through lines of his own men, who crowded around him, weeping, reaching out to touch his coat, his boots, Traveler's mane, as though contact with him might make this moment less real. Lee reportedly could not speak at all. He raised his hat. He turned the horse. He rode away. Before we get to what happened after Appomattox, because that last chapter may be the most important of all, I have to ask you something, and I want you to answer it in the comments below. We just watched Robert E. Lee sign the surrender of his army. He dressed magnificently for that moment. He kept his composure. He accepted full blame for Gettysburg. He told his men to go home and be good citizens. Was that dignity genuine? Or was it, in some way, one final performance for history? Write your answer down there. No wrong answers. But this community has thought harder about moments like this than most people ever do. And what you all come up with changes how I think about these stories. Every time. What came after Appomattox is, in some ways, the most consequential chapter of Robert E. Lee's life, and the most troubling. In the years following the war, Lee accepted the presidency of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, the school now called Washington and Lee University, where he spent the last 5 years of his life in relative quiet. He was paroled as a prisoner of war. He applied for amnesty and restoration of his United States citizenship. That application was misfiled by a State Department official and was not discovered until 1970. Congress passed a resolution restoring Lee's citizenship in 1975, 105 years after his death. He actively discouraged Confederate veterans from continuing guerrilla warfare against federal authority, and historians credit this as a genuine and important service to the country's reunification. He counseled acceptance of defeat and compliance with the law of the land. But he also became the central human figure in the most successful historical revision project in American history, the Lost Cause. This was the post-war narrative, developed deliberately by Confederate veterans, Southern journalists, former officers, and political leaders, that reframed the Confederacy not as a rebellion in defense of slavery, but as a noble constitutional struggle for Southern honor and state sovereignty. In this version of events, the war had almost nothing to do with slavery. It was about principle. It was about the rights of states against the tyranny of a distant central government. It was about brave men defending their homes against an overwhelming invader, and Robert E. Lee was its god. This mythology did not emerge spontaneously. It was built. Statues were commissioned, not in the immediate aftermath of the war, but decades later, during the establishment of Jim Crow laws, and again during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The equestrian statue of Lee on Monument Avenue in Richmond was dedicated in 1890, 25 years after the war ended. These were not simply monuments to the dead. They were political statements, declarations about who controlled the memory of the war and who controlled the meaning of the South. Lee gave interviews that fed the narrative. He appeared at veterans' gatherings that sanctified it. He allowed his image to be used for a version of Civil War history that systematically minimized the role of slavery in causing the conflict and the role of slavery in defining the Confederacy's stated purpose. And in his letters and public statements from this period, he consistently wrote about healing the country, about moving past division, about rebuilding. These sentiments were real. They mattered. But he said not one publicly documented word, not one, about the 4 million people who had been enslaved. Not one word about the freed people navigating a violent and legally precarious freedom. Not one word about the black veterans of the United States Colored Troops. 180,000 of them had served, 36,000 had died, whose story vanishes completely when Robert E. Lee becomes the war's central figure. Robert E. Lee died on October 12, 1870, at the age of 63, from complications following a stroke. He never regained the power of speech after the stroke struck him. His last documented words, spoken during a fever in the final days, were, "Strike the tent." He left behind a family, a college, a complicated will, and a legend that would grow for the next 100 years into something almost entirely disconnected from the man who had actually lived and chosen and fought and surrendered. In 2017, the announced removal of a Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia triggered a rally by white nationalist groups that turned violent, leaving one counter-protester dead. The statue came down in 2021. The marble man keeps cracking. So what do we actually do with Robert E. Lee? The military record is genuinely extraordinary. He took a Confederate army that was outnumbered in virtually every major campaign it fought and made it militarily competitive through audacity, intelligence, aggression, and a force of personal will that his men translated into battlefield performance that no amount of Union numbers could simply override. Military historians across a century and a half, including Dwight Eisenhower, who kept a portrait of Lee in the Oval Office, and Winston Churchill, who called him one of the greatest commanders in history, have praised his operational thinking. But his strategy contained a fatal flaw that historians increasingly refuse to overlook. It was, catastrophically, ruinously expensive in blood for a nation that simply could not afford the bill. Lee consistently suffered proportionally higher casualties than any other major Confederate commander when measured against the total manpower available to the Confederacy. The Army of Northern Virginia bled itself magnificent and then bled itself dead. Gettysburg alone, 28,000 casualties, was a wound the Confederate war effort never healed from. And the larger strategic picture? Lee ignored it. While he was winning brilliant tactical victories in Virginia, the Confederacy was collapsing in the West. Vicksburg fell the day after Pickett's charge, Chattanooga went in November, and Sherman was marching through Georgia while Lee was conducting siege warfare at Petersburg. Lee never publicly argued for a more sustainable defensive strategy in Virginia that might have preserved his army. He fought, always, to win the battle immediately in front of him, without enough attention to the war as an entire organism. Then there is the moral ledger, the one Lee never fully opened in public. He chose to fight 4 years for a government whose own founding documents explicitly protected slavery, whose own leaders explicitly, publicly called slavery the foundation of their new civilization. He owned enslaved people himself. He managed them, enforced their captivity, and when they escaped, he had them returned and punished. He had options. Many Virginia-born officers chose the Union, including George Thomas, who became one of the war's most effective generals. Lee chose otherwise. His composure at Appomattox was real. His counsel against guerrilla warfare was real. His desire for healing was real. These things matter. A bitter man with Robert E. Lee's prestige and moral authority among Southerners could have prolonged suffering enormously. But dignity at the end does not erase what came before it. The question has never been whether Robert E. Lee was a complex man. Every human being is complex. The question is which parts of his complexity we choose to center, and why, and what that choice does to our understanding of the war and its consequences. For more than a century, America centered the marble general, the noble Virginian, the tragic hero, the great man who wept over the losses he had ordered and accepted blame with grace. What disappears in that story are the 620,000 dead, the 4 million enslaved people for whose continued bondage Lee was willing to fight and kill, the black soldiers who died in blue uniforms to end what Lee died to preserve. History does not require us to make Robert E. Lee a monster. It requires us to make him human, which is both more difficult and more honest. He was a man of extraordinary gifts who made a choice in April 1861 that set in motion 4 years of catastrophic destruction. He was a commander of brilliant instincts and strategic blind spots. He was a product of a slaveholding society who chose to serve that society at its moment of greatest crisis and never publicly reckoned with what it had required of him. He was a man who dressed for surrender and kept his dignity in it. And then, in the years after the war, he allowed himself to become the centerpiece of a mythology that his side had lost the war but won the history, that reframed their cause and softened their guilt and shaped the racial politics of America for 160 years. That may have been, in the end, the most effective campaign of his entire career. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee rode away from Appomattox on Traveler. The Union soldiers lining the road came to attention. Some saluted the defeated general as he passed. Lee returned the salutes and kept riding, into the morning light, into a mythology that was already forming around him, tight as a second skin, as immovable as marble. The Marble Man, the gentle warrior, the tragic hero of a lost cause. The legend survived the man by a century and a half. It is still, in ways that matter to living people in a living country, with us today. And that is why this story is not just history. That is why this story is right now. If this changed something in how you see Robert E. Lee or the Civil War or the way we remember our wars, hit the like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. These stories deserve more than a textbook paragraph. And the next video we have coming, it goes even deeper into the commanders this war made and broke. You do not want to miss it.